They always know when you've left them long before your body walks out the door. They feel it when your spirit stops reaching for their approval. They sense it the moment your soul chooses clarity over chaos. That is when the fear begins, not yours, but theirs. A narcissist doesn't unravel when you raise your voice. They unravel when you no longer seek theirs. When the confusion they've used to bind you no longer disorients you. When your silence no longer signals surrender, but signals truth. That's what they fear: detachment rooted not in resentment, but in revelation. You reach that point not through rage, but through exhaustion. Not because you gave up on love, but because you discovered it was never truly there. There comes a moment when your prayers change from "God, help me fix this," to "God, help me let go." And once that prayer leaves your lips, even softly, something shifts. Heaven leans in, not to save the relationship, but to save what remains of you. What follows is not immediate. God doesn't yank you out of bondage with sirens and lightning. He moves subtly at first, giving you glimpses. Patterns you once justified become clear. Excuses you used to make start to feel hollow. The energy in your spirit that used to chase their validation begins to feel sacred again. And you can't unknow what you've seen. You begin to realize you were not in love. You were in survival. The narcissist isn't surprised by your pain. They're surprised by your clarity. They never feared your heartbreak. They feared the day you would stop needing them to heal it. Because as long as you chased them, they had leverage. As long as you explained yourself, they had control. As long as you tried to prove your goodness, they remained central. But once God becomes your center, they lose their position. The detachment that terrifies them the most is not bitter or violent. It's holy. It's the calm that descends when you finally stop worshiping at the altar of their opinion. It's the internal stillness that cannot be baited back into chaos. They notice when you stop flinching. They notice when your spirit stops contorting itself to fit inside their dysfunction. There is no script for that moment, no line you deliver that causes their world to collapse. The collapse begins when your presence no longer responds on cue, when your emotions no longer rise and fall to their manipulations, when their provocations return empty and their silence no longer evokes panic. That stillness God authored and soul defended is the beginning of your resurrection. You didn't reach it through force. You arrived by being broken open, by watching yourself shrink again and again for the sake of peace, until peace itself became unrecognizable. You held your breath for so long inside that dynamic, you forgot what breathing felt like, and then without warning, you exhaled. Not in rebellion, in remembrance. It is there, in that breath, that God meets you, not to shame you for how long you stayed, but to reveal why you couldn't leave. Because it was never just about them. It was about a story buried deep in your psyche, maybe from childhood, maybe from a past heartbreak that told you love had to hurt, that your needs were too much, that staying quiet was how you earned connection. The narcissists didn't create that story. They exploited it. God doesn't simply pull you out of abuse. He rewrites the story that kept you in it. He reaches back to the first time you learned that love required your silence. The first time you believed you had to earn affection by disappearing. And he begins the slow, sacred work of replacing those lies with truth. This is why narcissists fear divine detachment, because it's not emotional withdrawal. It's spiritual awakening. It's not a tactic. It's a transformation. Once you see the truth through God's eyes, you can no longer unsee it through theirs. They were never afraid of losing you. They were afraid of you finding yourself, because the moment you do, their power collapses, not because you stripped it from them, but because you stopped contributing to the illusion. And without your participation, their identity begins to crack. The narcissist doesn't love. They attach through need. Their identity is sustained by extracting energy from others. Your empathy became their engine. Your forgiveness became their excuse. But the moment God awakens discernment in you, the game ends. You no longer offer your empathy without boundaries. You no longer give forgiveness without fruit. You no longer confuse chaos with connection. This detachment, led by God, doesn't look like emotional numbness. It looks like alignment. It looks like sitting in the same room with them and not needing their validation. It looks like hearing their blame and feeling nothing stir inside your spirit. Not because you're empty, but because you're full with peace, with clarity, with God. They try to provoke a response, and you remain unmoved. They accuse you of selfishness, and you no longer explain. They question your silence, and you let the silence stand. You're no longer there to manage their discomfort. You're not responsible for their inability to self-regulate. And this, more than anything, dismantles the structure they've built around you. When someone has been accustomed to managing you through guilt, your calm confuses them. When they've been able to control your choices through fear, your peace unnerves them. When you stop defending yourself, they lose access. And what they fear most is a person of God who no longer fears them. This boundary, born from faith, is not about punishment. It's about restoration. You're not walking away to hurt them. You're walking away because God revealed the cost of staying. And once He shows you, He doesn't ask you to return. He asks you to trust Him with the ache, with the grief, with the void. Healing isn't instant. Sometimes it's disorienting. You'll still miss the idea of what could have been. You'll still grieve the fantasy you tried to make real, but you'll no longer return to someone who showed you they were willing to harm you to feel powerful. God detaches you for a reason, not just to end the relationship, but to begin the rebuilding. You begin to remember who you were before you were made small. You begin to feel again without the filter of fear. You begin to pray for wholeness, not reconciliation. That shift is divine. And it threatens the narcissist because it reveals what they always feared, that their power was never real. It only existed when you forgot who you were. As you step deeper into detachment, your language changes. You no longer say, "They broke me." You say, "God rebuilt me." You no longer ask, "Why did they do this to me?" You ask, "What did God want to show me through this?" Your focus moves from reaction to revelation, and that shift rewrites your story. Eventually, you look back, not with rage, but with clarity. You stop obsessing over what you lost, and you begin to see what you gained: wisdom, discernment, boundaries, conviction, peace. You stop needing closure from them because God gave you closure through the awakening. You stop waiting for an apology because the lesson became the gift. And when the narcissist returns, and they almost always try, you don't respond with anger. You respond with detachment that carries the authority of heaven. Your no doesn't shake. Your silence is no longer heavy. You don't need to justify your boundary because your peace is self-evident. This is what they fear, not the boundary itself, but the force behind it. Not the words you speak, but the spirit you now walk in. Not your absence, but your liberation. You're no longer the person who needed their attention to feel worthy. You've been rewritten, and the author was never them. You don't recognize the change in yourself at first. It doesn't come in a dramatic moment or bold proclamation. It comes quietly. When their texts no longer shake your resolve, when the silence you once feared now feels like sanctuary, when their praise doesn't revive your longing and their insults no longer cut beneath the skin, God doesn't remove the narcissist just to protect you from them. He removes them so he can reintroduce you to who you were before they distorted your reflection. The detachment he guides you into is not simply emotional distance. It's spiritual realignment. It draws you back to your original design before you were taught to equate pain with passion, confusion with closeness, and manipulation with meaning. You begin to see clearly, not just them, but you, your patterns, your compromises, the spaces in your soul that once made their behavior tolerable. And instead of shame, you feel gratitude for the clarity that pain could finally deliver. Because when your spirit is ready, God doesn't just show you what they did, He shows you why you accepted it. And when He does, you're no longer angry that they fooled you. You're focused on why you silenced yourself to keep peace. That's the turning point, because healing from narcissistic abuse isn't just about avoiding them. It's about no longer abandoning yourself. When you detach with God, your focus shifts. You stop trying to prove your worth to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop over-explaining yourself to keep relationships that drain your spirit. You stop tolerating inconsistency just to avoid loneliness. Your priorities begin to reflect your peace, not your pain. And that shift isn't something the narcissist can negotiate with. They will try. They always do. They'll try to re-enter through confusion, through charm, through the illusion of humility. They may even mimic the language of healing. They'll say they've changed, they've seen the light, they miss your soul. But what they miss isn't your soul. What they miss is control. What they fear is not your anger. It's your indifference. You don't return fire. You return to silence. Not because you're hiding, but because you've outgrown the conversation. They don't know how to operate in a relationship they can't control. They don't know how to engage with someone who no longer performs on emotional command. They don't know how to reach someone whose identity is now rooted in truth, not response. And while they may not say it, they feel it, the shift in power. Because power, to a narcissist, is not strength, it's access. And you've cut that access not by slamming the door, but by locking it from the inside, quietly, permanently. That's what God-led detachment does. It doesn't create walls to keep others out. It strengthens your inner gate. It gives you discernment, the kind that no longer reacts to chaos, no longer entertains drama disguised as reconciliation, the kind that no longer ignores the early signs in favor of potential that was never yours to fix. You learn to love differently. You stop loving people's potential and start loving their patterns. You stop waiting for them to become what they promised and start trusting what they repeatedly showed you. You realize that love without truth is bondage, and loyalty without boundaries is self-erasure. And while the narcissist spirals, seeking a way back into the role they once played in your life, you've moved on, not through distraction, but through realignment. You don't need closure from someone incapable of honesty. You don't need validation from someone who built their identity on your uncertainty. You've learned to sit with yourself long enough to remember you were never unworthy. You were simply targeted for your light. And that's why they came. Not because you were weak, but because you were radiant, empathetic, open-hearted, capable of love they couldn't reciprocate. And in their world, that kind of light isn't cherished, it's consumed. But God didn't let them consume you completely. He waited, He watched. And when your spirit could no longer bear the weight of the illusion, He opened your eyes, not just to the narcissist's behavior, but to the truth of who you are apart from it. That's the difference between escape and deliverance. Escape is reactive. Deliverance is divine. Escape is running. Deliverance is rising. Escape seeks relief. Deliverance seeks rebirth. And once you're delivered, You no longer walk with open wounds. You walk with wisdom. You become harder to reach, not because you've closed off, but because you've been recentered. You don't chase relationships. You discern them. You don't abandon your intuition. You anchor in it. You don't ask God to bless red flags. You walk away before you need confirmation. And to the narcissist, this kind of detachment is devastating, not because it hurts them emotionally, but because it proves they never had the control they believed they had. It reveals that their power was never internal. It was always borrowed from your confusion. Now that the confusion is gone, so is their access. There's no rage in you now, just discernment. There's no obsession, just closure. There's no desire to be understood, just peace in knowing you understand yourself. And that's what they fear the most, that you've finally seen them clearly and kept walking. Not out of pride, but out of obedience, not to a feeling, but to a calling. Because God doesn't call you to manage emotional torment. He calls you to walk in truth. He doesn't ask you to prove your worth through pain. He asks you to protect what he planted in you long before they tried to devalue it. This is what holy detachment looks like. Not disengagement from love, but a redefinition of it. Love that protects. Love that discerns. Love that does not negotiate with manipulation. Love that starts with God and flows from him, not through broken vessels demanding to be your source. You no longer hand your heart to anyone who hasn't earned your trust. You no longer explain your intuition to people committed to invalidating it. You no longer feel guilty for choosing peace over proximity. That's not distance, that's deliverance in today's. And when they watch you from afar, wondering why their words don't land, why their games don't work, why their silence doesn't wound, they begin to understand what they could never control: the presence of God in someone who finally surrendered to truth. You became untouchable the moment you stopped being reactive. You became powerful the moment you stopped proving yourself. You became free the moment you stopped making room for someone who only loved you when you were in pieces. That is the God-led detachment that makes narcissists fear you forever. Not because you hurt them, but because you stopped needing them. And they will never understand how you walked away so quietly, so completely, so finally. But you will, because you didn't walk alone. If what you heard stirred something in you, if it reminded you of what you've lived, what you've lost, or what you're finally ready to reclaim, this space was created for you. Not for followers, for survivors, for truth seekers, for those who have chosen peace over performance, healing over habit, and God over manipulation. If your journey has brought you to this moment, you're not alone, and you never were. Subscribe to continue walking this path with others who understand the weight you've carried, the silence you've endured, and the strength it took to let go. Turn on notifications if you want reminders that your discernment is sacred, that your healing is holy, and that your story is still being written by a hand greater than theirs. This isn't just content, this is restoration, and you're exactly where you're meant to be.